All right, today we're diving into a pretty provocative idea. What happens when millions of men just quietly walk away from society? And maybe more importantly, what happens when governments try to force them to come back?
It all starts with this one number, 0.7. And that single number, it's at the very heart of this story. It's a birth rate so low, it's signaling a potential demographic collapse for an entire nation.
And yeah, this is where it's happening right now. South Korea. They've basically hit a demographic cliff. Each new generation is just so much smaller than the one before it that, well, unless something changes in a big way, their population is literally on a path to disappearing.
So, what's behind this? What's the cause? Well, the analysis we're exploring today makes a really bold claim. It argues this whole crisis stems from a kind of quiet revolution, a massive, voluntary withdrawal of men from society as we've always known it.
Okay, so let's really get into this idea of a silent exodus. The argument here isn't that this is about a few guys here and there. No, it's a deep structural shift. We're talking millions of men, all on their own, making the exact same choice to just opt out.
And get this, just in the United States, they're talking about tens of millions of guys. Working-age men who've unplugged from the whole 9-to-5 grind, and from all those traditional expectations about getting married, starting a family, and instead, they're off building totally new kinds of lives for themselves.
Right. So you have to ask, why? What's the driving force here? The analysis we're looking at frames it as a totally rational choice. It's a response to a new risk versus reward calculation. For a lot of men, the old bargain, it just doesn't seem like a good deal anymore. And this slide, it just lays out the core argument perfectly. The old social contract for men was pretty straightforward, right? You provide. In return, you get stability, you get status, you get a family. But that's been replaced, or so the argument goes, with a new reality that's seen as a high-risk, low-reward proposition, just full of legal and cultural landmines. So when you look at the specifics, for a growing number of men, you've got things like really high divorce rates, massive financial risks from alimony and child support, and, a cultural conversation that often frames masculinity as toxic. According to this view, all those things have basically turned marriage from a cornerstone of life into what feels like a really, really high-stakes poker game.
Okay, so what's the ripple effect? What happens when all these millions of individual choices start to add up? Well, let's get into the fallout. The analysis actually calls it a form of societal bankruptcy.
Now, this is really interesting. The analysis points out that, yeah, women drive most consumer spending, about 85%, but a huge chunk of that spending power has historically been fueled by men's earnings. So when men start pulling back from the workforce, that whole economic engine just starts to sputter. And it's not just consumer spending. The analysis also claims that men, particularly high-earning men, have traditionally paid a huge share of the total taxes, like around 80%. So as they step away from those high-stress, high-paying jobs, that directly hammers government revenue. We're talking about the money that funds everything, from social programs to roads and bridges. And look, this is not just happening in the US, not by a long shot. The source material points to this same pattern playing out all over the developed world. You've got Japan's sustained decline, China's so-called marriage strike. The trend of falling birth rates is absolutely a global thing. So what's the response from the top? Faced with this growing crisis, the analysis argues that governments are starting to change their game plan. They're moving beyond just simple incentives, little tax breaks, and they're starting to look at much more forceful, almost coercive measures, all designed to push men back into those traditional family roles. And you can really see this escalation playing out right here on this timeline. I mean, look at Japan. They're adding a surcharge on medical insurance to fund child-rearing, basically a tax on being childless. Then you have China slapping a new tax on contraceptives. And right here in the US, you've got influential policy groups pushing for something even more hands-on, government-backed programs to actively promote marriage. And this is probably the most striking proposal of them all, which has been detailed by think tanks like the Heritage Foundation. The idea of marriage boot camps. These would be government-backed programs designed to literally train, guide, and incentivize people to get married. And let's be super clear about this. The point isn't just education. This is a whole structured system. We're talking financial rewards for completing the program, big communal ceremonies, even assigned mentors to guide you. It's all designed to engineer one very specific outcome, creating a stable two-child family to get that birth rate back up.
So, the big question is, will any of this actually work? The analysis we're covering says a pretty firm no. It predicts that these kinds of measures are basically doomed to fail. Why? Because the choice men are making isn't some temporary phase, it's become permanent. And this is the key part, it's become sustainable.
It really comes down to this. The argument is that this isn't driven by anger anymore. It's about men discovering something else, a sense of peace, of contentment in their own company. They've built lives that don't need outside approval. And that's a really powerful discovery that isn't easily reversed by government programs. I mean, think about how they've done it. They've built these totally viable alternative lifestyles. They're using the gig economy, maybe some crypto, to get financially independent. They're cutting their expenses way down through minimalism. They're even moving to cheaper countries, and they're building their own communities online. They've created a whole new, sustainable model for living. And when you have that, going back to the old high-risk system, it just looks, well, pretty unappealing. And that leaves us with the final, really provocative question from this whole analysis. If the old social contract is broken and trying to force a new one is just not going to work, then what on earth comes next? When a society's most basic